Welcome back to our MSR colloquium. I'm really excited to have Adam Frost here. Some of you had a chance to meet him today. There will be a reception right after this. It awkwardly won't happen in the hallway because we have no hallway. So we'll just make our way out to kind of the entryway across the elevator, windows and river and food and stuff. So if you haven't had a chance to talk to him, there's time then. And I think we may also be able to have you back tomorrow for lunch. That's a possibility. So,
yeah.
So you can find him. Adam is a PhD student at Harvard. He is in the History Department and the East Asian Languages Department. Yeah, I'll wait for the
We have a whole crowd, yeah.
No, it's good. You got permission. You don't. Yeah. All right. Adam Frost is a PhD student at Harvard. He's in history and East Asian languages. I believe you came across Jennifer at some point, and she was impressed and excited and wanted you over here. She is sorry she couldn't be here for the talk. He is also a Fulbright Student Award winner. He is currently spending the semester in Helsinki, but we'll have him back in Boston for next year as he finishes up. Also, a documentary you made called The End of Bitterness.
Yeah.
About
everyday lives of beggars in Northwest China.
I want to see that too. So thanks so much for coming, and take it away.
Great, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about my research on the history of entrepreneurship and underground capitalism in socialist China, and how I'm using unconventional sources and new methods to explore the origins of China's economic rise. But first, let me begin with a story. So about a 2 hours drive north of Shanghai, in the middle of the countryside where it's all fields and factories, there's this 70-story luxury hotel that just kind of rises out of the countryscape. And as you can see atop this hotel, there's a golden sphere, kind of like the Eye of Sauron. And inside of this sphere is a revolving restaurant, which is staffed exclusively by North Korean waitresses. And here one can dine on fresh sashimi and French wine and enjoy a panoramic view of the beautiful surrounding countryside. 10 floors below that, there's a gold-themed lounge. Everything's gold. The walls are gold, the floor is gold. And in the middle of that lounge is a 1 metric ton solid gold bull. It's worth like $60-something million. And so this whole thing it's a cathedral of conspicuous wealth. And it was built to celebrate the 50th year anniversary of the founding of Huaxi, the wealthiest village in China. Huaxi it's a strange place. It's a mixture of red theater and opulence. Everywhere in the village there's statues of Mao Zedong standing next to Wu Renbao, the founder of the village. The streets in Huaxi are lined by lane after lane of 3-story European villas. In front of every villa there's a BMW parked in the driveway. At the edge of the village there's this thing called the World Park, which has a replica of Tiananmen, of the Great Wall, but also of the Statue of Liberty, Big Ben, the Arc of Triumph, and other things. And in this socialist paradise, everything is owned and controlled by the village corporation. And as long as villagers do the bidding of the corporation, and as long as they uphold the reputation of their community, then they get to live lives of socialist luxury. But what is most strange about Huaxi is not the way it distributes and performs its wealth, but the manner in which it became so wealthy in the first place. So according to the myth that is taught to every Huaxi child in school, the village's rise had everything to do with the indomitable Huaxi spirit and the singular vision of the chief, the founder, Wu Renbao. When the Huaxi Brigade was formed in 1961, it was a really poor community. Farmers lived in mud brick houses and they farmed tiny parcels of land. But under the leadership of this guy, Wu Renbao, they banded together and they built dikes and they dug irrigation networks and they manually transformed the landscape. And the story goes they eventually made it amenable to agriculture. And with more productive lands, they began accumulating surplus, which they saved and continually reinvested in the community. And after China's opening up and reform in 1978, the village voluntarily decided to stay a collective. and it continued to pour the whole of the community's wealth into the creation of new collective enterprises. And Huaxi's model, this collective model of organization, later became known as the Sunan model of development in China, one of the major ways of growth and development. After visiting Huaxi for the first time, I became really interested in its history and in the truth of its economic rise. So with the help of some acquaintances, I was able to connect with a few elderly villagers there and begin interviewing them, and they agreed to speak with me as long as I kept their names secret. And these individuals began providing a really alternative and more compelling explanation for Huaxi's rise. According to their accounts, during China's socialist era, Huaxi was an epicenter of illicit economic activity. In the wake of the Great Leap Forward, when the country was suffering from severe shortages of food, clothing, other things, the village established a waste textile station, and they began buying up old clothes from villagers in the surrounding villages and recycling it into cloth, which they then sold on gray markets. A few years later, the village hired a sent-down worker, a guy who had been a factory worker in Shanghai and who was sent down to the countryside, and they hired him to help build an ironworks, which they used to begin producing simple agricultural implements. By the start of the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s, Huaxi had already accumulated enough capital from these enterprises to purchase an industrial lathe, a punch press, and other really expensive metalworking tools. And such industrial equipment, I was told, was actually readily available. They bought it from the Navy. Naval officers were selling it to communities in the area and helping them actually establish underground factories. And then Huaxi began hiring more quote-unquote Sunday engineers. These were experts who worked in state-owned factories and stuff. And then on the weekends, they would go and contract out their labor to informal enterprises. And they began producing things like really high-quality drill bits and threading dies and things, and then selling them all over China to places as far as Liaoning in the north and Sichuan in the west. So from these stories, I learned that Huaxi's rise really didn't have much to do with the so-called Sunan model of development or the Huaxi spirit. And while it certainly took advantage of the market reforms of the 1980s, its growth was not initiated by them. Rather, Huaxi's success was a product of the knowledge and networks and capital that it accumulated during the socialist era. In other words, by the time that China embarked on the process of reform and opening up in 1978, Huaxi was already well positioned to take off. And so as I learned more about this kind of untold history of Huaxi, I began to wonder if what was true of the village might also be true of China as a whole. I began to ask, were there entrepreneurs who continued to operate and innovate throughout China's socialist era? And if so, what did the processes of entrepreneurship look like? Where did they occur? And what effects did they have on the overall development of the Chinese economy? So these are really large questions, of course, but they've only been tentatively explored in the existing scholarship. Most studies have really focused on the political and institutional structure of China's socialist economy. They look at how key institutions such as the commune or the work unit, the danwei, and the household registration system, how they operated. But much less attention has been focused on how the economy worked in practice, on how people got things done when the formal system could and often did fail. And this is mostly due to the simple fact that these things are really hard to study. Such topics demand new sources and new methods that not all historians are necessarily comfortable with. So 3 years ago, while I was visiting a Chinese flea market, I came across some documents related to underground capitalists in the 1960s. There were a dozen or so large brown folders like this, each of which concerned the case of a so-called speculator and profiteer, 投机倒把 for Chinese people. And it was people like these men who were prosecuted for engaging in illicit commerce or selling ration coupons or other economic crimes. Each of the cases that I found, they involved a summary like this, which spoke of the types of illicit economic activities that these people were doing, on how much money they were earning, on what type of goods were involved. And these cases dealt with all manner of things. Some talked about illegally produced textiles and illegally hunted furs. Some talked about smuggled wristwatches. Others talked about musical instruments and even firearms. So all kinds of things were being traded in these illicit markets. And when I asked the seller, where did you get these documents? He told me that he had bought them from an archivist in a nearby city when the archive was doing its cleaning, and that they were part of a much bigger collection. So after chatting with him a bit more, he agreed to take me back to his house, and I ended up purchasing a whole set of materials. This was my first collection that I bought. And he agreed to introduce me to other merchants who also had similar stuff. So over the next few years, I networked with a whole community of these document sellers, both in person and online. And I procured tens of thousands of pages, I think about 30, 40,000 right now, pages of materials related to underground capitalism and socialist China. And what I found is that these kind of sources, as opposed to official state archives, they paint a radically different portrait of how the economy functioned in practice. They show that throughout society, there were innumerable entrepreneurs who were identifying opportunities to profit from inefficiencies in the planned economy, and more generally, just to make things work. And they offer accounts of, for example, farmers who traveled to cities to sell handicrafts to urban workers, or merchants who purchased large quantities of goods and smuggled them to other administrative regions, or even state-owned factories that would procure goods outside of the system of formal distribution and buy things at market prices rather than state-fixed prices. In other words, the documents said that everywhere there were entrepreneurs who were filling the voids in the socialist system. So since I'm still in the middle phases of my research, I'm writing up the dissertation right now, rather than attempt to make a bunch of big overarching historical arguments, I'm going to show you how I'm engaging with these sources and how I'm using them to conduct both quantitative and qualitative methods of analysis. And I'll argue that it's exactly through the process of combining different modes of analysis that we can maximize the utility of these sources, and that we can ultimately arrive at deeper understandings of how the Chinese economy actually functioned. Yeah? Sorry? Yeah?
Are these documents just about the people that got caught?
Yes, just the people that got caught. Yeah.
So we don't know what fraction that is of all the people.
I can talk about that later. I'm writing papers on that. But yeah, I mean, basically, no. These are the people that selectively got caught by the state. Was there someone else?
It was basically the same. My question was who produced these documents?
Yep, these are state agencies who are identifying and prosecuting entrepreneurs in the economy, the underground capitalists, or as they call it, speculators and profiteers. Yeah?
Is the selling of these documents an underground economy by itself?
Yes. You got to do illicit economics to study illicit economics. But it's not just me. There's other people that are doing this as well, collecting these documents and using them to develop new insights about the Maoist economy. But I'm the first one to do it for economic stuff. Everyone.
In particular, I mean, are these sort of secret documents? I mean, are they sort of, was the police officer never allowed to sell that? Or
Yeah, these are
found in some ways
No, these are totally illicit. The state doesn't really care that I'm buying these because it's just too small. These aren't central government documents, these are local government documents. But basically what happened was the local government agencies produced these. They conducted all of these investigations about underground capitalists in the economy. They produced these investigative reports and others, and there's other kinds of documents there too. And they housed them in local archives. But over time, just so much stuff built up. The Maoist state was really good about recording lots of stuff, and the archives filled up. So then they had to have an archival cleansing to open up space. And when that happened, it was during the 1980s, and there were paper shortages in China. And so the state said, okay, archivist, instead of just burning them, turn your archives over to paper pulpers, who will pulp them and recycle them and will use them to produce new paper. But somewhere in that chain of custody, from archivist to paper pulper, someone said, I bet I can make a lot more money by selling these to private collectors. And so they entered into private circulation. And then I was able to track down these collectors, the people who had bought the documents in the 1980s. And then after you meet one, he can introduce you to a lot more. And then just working through that network, I was able to find a lot more of these documents, buy them back, and then basically create my own archive. So that's the gist. Yep.
How much were they?
I get that question every time, actually. I've spent about $7,000. Which, I mean, it's a lot for a graduate student, but it's not that much to build an archive. Okay, so...
How much is the value for the paper?
Oh, nothing. I mean, right? I mean, if these were pulped, it would be, $5, $10. It's worth nothing in its weight in paper. But now they're worth a lot. The merchants are selling them to historians like me, and they realize they can game us against each other too. So they're making nice profits. So as I said, I'm going to use multiple kind of modes of analysis to engage with these sources and to show how different modes of analysis allow us kind of different lenses into how the economy was functioning in practice. So let me move to my first mode of analysis, which is the kind of most traditional, most established, the case study approach, the deep reading of individual sources. So among the thousands of cases of speculation and profiteering that I've collected, there are a handful of exceptionally detailed ones, which offer really unique insights into how entrepreneurs were making economic decisions and how they were also justifying their actions to state actors. And to illustrate what this looks like and how these sources might be used, I'll talk here about the curious case of this man, Cheng Guoheng. He's a socialist fashion designer. So Cheng Guoheng was an educated man. He was born to a small capitalist family in Hangzhou. And after graduating from middle school, he worked as an accountant for the government and later as a management of the shop. Now, after the communists rose to power in 1949, he was persecuted because he had ties to the former government. And so he was sentenced to detention and re-education. But after he was released, he moved from Hangzhou to Nanjing, and he opened the 100 Flowers Artisans Cooperative. And he began producing clothing patterns, such as these, for sale. Very fashionable pants, as you can see. And then he sold these to socialist consumers. And socialist consumers, of course, they had to have ration coupons, they bought cloth, and then they used these patterns to sew their own clothing. Now, in 1965, a decade later, Chun came under attack as an unrepentant capitalist. And after a series of lengthy investigations, the so-called Market Administration Office found Chun guilty of tax evasion, of underground printing and marketing, and collusion with other capitalists and counter-revolutionaries. So according to the investigative reports, Chun was actually the ringleader of an illicit network of designers who produced, transported, and sold, quote-unquote, outlandish clothing patterns, such as these, very outlandish, as you can see, across 23 provinces and 2 autonomous governing regions of China. So basically the whole of China. Yeah?
When you say that, when these entrepreneurs are selling these items, what is the currency they're using? Is it mostly these ration coupons? Is there kind of trade going on?
They're selling it for money. I mean, there's money in the Maoist economy. It's not a cashless economy. I'll say Chun's products were so popular that not only did regular consumers buy them, but even state-run shops began purchasing them and selling them. And within the span of 2 years, he supposedly derived more than 3,000 yuan in illegal profits. And this is an astronomical figure, and I'll put that into perspective in a little bit. Yeah?
I'm a Chinese. Can answer the generalist question a little better. Is that you can have cash, but without that ration coupon, you cannot purchase anything.
So that's not true for this.
Oh,
so you don't need ration. So I'll actually talk about the coupon economy very shortly. For these, you don't need ration coupons to purchase them. You need receipts. And you're going to have a receipt and a stub. And it's usually one enterprise buys from another enterprise. And there has to be a whole document trail. So it's complicated, but basically the currency they're using is cash. So over the next 10 years, Chun would be repeatedly arrested, prosecuted, and punished for an array of economic and political crimes. However, rather than submit, he resisted prosecution the whole time. And he wrote more than a dozen letters of appeal to higher government offices, defending his actions and justifying his motives. In these letters, he argues that the real reason he was prosecuted by this local government agency is that he had outcompeted state-run enterprises. He points out a fundamental contradiction in the government's position toward individual enterprise. For the Chinese speakers, 个体户. And although he and another handful of individuals, about 148,000 people in the Chinese economy, had been granted licenses to operate independently as businessmen, he argued that if he actually created products that the masses desired, if he did his job, then he would ultimately run afoul of state-run enterprises because they believed they could do everything. And such arrogance, he said, on the part of these enterprises had resulted in a general decline in the quality of goods such as these patterns. As he explained, here's a quote from his case, "Now there are no good clothing designs. Why is this? In Xuanwu district of the Red Flag Blueprint Cooperative struggled to attract business, so they turned to a local textile company to supply them with patterns. However, they soon found that the patterns the company created did not suit the demands of the masses. The designs weren't good looking, and the variety of articles was too limited. As a result, sales were sluggish, and they soon suspended production." And I love this last line. "In this business, there is no shortage of arrogant people who think they can do everything themselves and end up failing halfway through." So this is a pretty damning critique, right, of the formal socialist economy and these state-run enterprises. And in these letters of appeal, this is just one of, like I said, about a dozen or so, Chun is arguing that there are fundamental limits to the capacity of state-run enterprises and large-scale collectives to satisfy society's demands. He says no matter how skilled their employees or how efficient their factors of production, there's certain tasks, such as the design of clothing patterns, that they're simply not equipped to handle. And he said this is because they're too far removed from the people they're ostensibly producing clothing for. One more quote, last quote. "When designing clothing, one cannot create as one pleases, nor can one work while isolated from sources of information. One must unify the social habits and customs of one's country with knowledge about the human form and modern style. If one does not proceed in this way, then one will produce bizarre clothing that is unsuitable for the masses. Therefore, in addition to consulting the other countries' designs, as well as the intrinsic characteristics of Chinese ethnic style," I love this part, "I also dive into the realities of life by visiting every clothing shop, by listening with an open heart to the suggestions of customers, by learning what styles the masses desire, and by exchanging experience with others in my trade. And it is from these aspects that I accumulate knowledge, and over the passing of months and years, innovate new techniques that improve the quality of my work." So I think this is pretty amazing. This is a guy writing a letter of protest to state agencies, and he's defending his kind of entrepreneurial ethic. And we see this so clearly, actually, in his work. So here we have 9 variations on a design for long-sleeve shirts that are designed for the laboring masses. So we notice that these shirts are supremely practical. I mean, they have high collars and big pockets. And the practicality is further highlighted by the fact that the models are shown clutching hose and their lunches. In this illustration, the imagery is even more overt, right? The person at the top right is spooning out slop to her pigs. The person here on the left is gazing out over her flock of sheep. Yet critically, these designs are also fashionable. The clothing is much shapelier than Zhongshan suits. There are also many variations on a single style. And the designs are situated within scenes of everyday life. As we can see here, the young shepherd is standing in a particularly fashionable pose that not only accentuates her short-sleeve shirt, but also shows how it can be stylishly paired with trousers and loafers. And it is these elements of fashion, based on intimate knowledge of consumer desire, that enabled Chun to generate such great demand for his designs, and why businesses throughout China, including the state-run department stores, were eager to buy his products and then have them on offer to their customers. So individual cases like that of Mr. Chun reveal that the individuals who were prosecuted as so-called speculators and profiteers in the economy were often entrepreneurs who created very real forms of value in the socialist economy. Through the utilization of their tacit knowledge and the enactment of different types of value, they produced and marketed goods that consumers ultimately desired. Moreover, entrepreneurs like Chun not only subverted state control of production and exchange, but they actively challenged it. By co-opting Maoist discourse and appealing to the needs of the masses, Chun was able to justify, he attempted at least, to justify his actions to the state and legitimize his contributions to society. So we've seen now how this kind of case study approach can, yeah, go ahead.
Is it a single merchant study, or do you observe any kind of like change of behavior across the time frame? Like, for example,
Of this one individual? Or?
Yeah, or do you have a multi-sample study?
So no, this is explicitly not multi-sided. As I said, this is the most traditional form of analysis. That's a case study, a classic, and of course it's much more detailed than this, but this is my limited presentation, right? So that is how most historians actually would do this kind of research, right? They would just focus, they'd pick 5 of these cases, and they would do very deep readings of all the, I mean, his case is 800 pages long. It's 4 giant tomes of investigation. They just keep investigating him, keep prosecuting him over 15 years. And so this is the kind of insights, I think, that you can derive about entrepreneurial processes through the deep reading of materials. But now I'm going to move on to a different type of analysis, much more like the one you're suggesting. So we've seen now how this kind of case study, deep reading approach can yield new insights into socialist economic practice. However, this method, as I'm sure you're implying, faces severe limitations. When reading a handful of cases or a single case, it's often impossible to really make sense of the actions of individuals because you don't know how they're situated within broader networks of activity. Worse still, you can't talk about his generalizability. Is this guy the exception, or is he one of hundreds of fashion designers in Maoist China? We don't know by just reading his one case. And so it's for these reasons that we need to turn to a second mode of analysis, the kind of meso reading of larger collections of sources. And here I'll show how by reading dozens and dozens of cases of speculation and profiteering together, we can begin to identify certain patterns in the modes of entrepreneurship. And to illustrate that, I'm going to focus on one particular sphere of illicit economic activity, the trading of ration coupons. Yep?
Can you give us some 10-second lesson on how money, how coupons, how the economy, what role money versus coupons plays in the economy?
My next paragraphs. So in the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party enacted systems of formal rationing and distribution. At first, this began for products like grain, really core products, but then it slowly expanded to other commodities, such as like cotton and coal. And for every one of these core commodities, the government agency would print and distribute ration coupons. So ration coupons are a little bit different than what most people think in maybe the Soviet context. So in the Chinese context, they're called priceless securities, 无价证券, that were theoretically valueless, and they could not legally be bought, sold, or traded. Coupons functioned as entitlements to make a certain purchase of a designated amount of good at a state-fixed price. So when a consumer would go to a state-run shop, they needed to come with both coupons and money in hand. Without the coupon, you're not entitled to a purchase. And without the money, you can't exercise that entitlement. So the coupons and the money work together in the economy. So basically, the formal circulation of coupons looks something like this. State agencies at all kinds of levels would print coupons. They would distribute them to local households or through people's work groups. And the households would then redeem them at a number of state agencies or state shops and things. And so this whole system kept coupons circulating within a really limited region, within a single county, within a single city, something like that. And this theoretically tied socialist consumers to their places of household registration. If you're a farmer who doesn't have ration coupons for this city, you're not going to be able to find food, right? That's the idea. Keep people locked down based upon where they're being issued coupons. However, much to the vexation of the state, these coupons became objects of private exchange. And entrepreneurs like this guy would buy up coupons and then circulate them outside of formal channels. So again, here's that formal system, and here's how the most simple form of illicit circulation would work. So you would have, in the simplest type of circulation, you had local coupon traders, like that guy I just showed you, who would travel from village to village, and they would buy up coupons from individual households and then resell them to other households. This is really important. Some households had more coupons than they needed. Other households were like on the verge of subsistence. If you were a farmer and had 5 children or something, or a factory worker and had 5 children, you may not have enough coupon to feed everybody. But if you only had 1 kid, you're probably getting more than you actually need to support the whole family. So these merchants helped redistribute them between households. Some traders were also a little bit more entrepreneurial, and they would collude directly with the state agencies. And they would just buy up whole coupon books, large quantities of coupons, and then recirculate them on a much larger scale. And there were also more, and these activities helped alleviate, like I said, the maldistribution of goods within communities. But there were also more complex types of circulation that helped redistribute coupons across space. So when local traders accumulated a large supply of coupons, instead of selling them directly to households, sometimes they would resell them on to wholesale brokers. And these brokers were specialists who identified regional differences in ration coupon prices, and then they would recirculate them from areas of lower to higher value. They're arbitraging prices across time and space. And this involved smuggling the coupons across these administrative boundaries, which they did through a number of methods. One case I have, a ration coupon guy had a big cart full of cabbages, and he had cut all the cabbages in half, cored them out, and then stuffed them full of ration coupons, and then glued them back together. And so they used all kinds of methods to try to illicitly circulate these across space. In this second type of more complex circulation, the brokers typically wouldn't sell them on directly. Instead, they would pass them on to an intermediary group of people that are sometimes referred to as coupon runners. And these are guys who are situated within the local communities. They're usually young guys with not much capital, but they know everybody. So they know who to sell the coupons to. And these coupon brokers would, for example, resell some of them to the bosses of underground factories that needed to be able to feed their workers. Others would sell them to labor gangs. So these guys would hire whole groups of workers from the countryside, illegally transport them to the city, and then contract out their labor to formal enterprises. So they needed coupons to be able to feed them again. And others still sold them to black guest houses. And these were basically underground hotels, illicit hotels. And the illicit hotels would maintain stocks of coupons to sell them to the businessmen and merchants that would travel there doing unsanctioned trade. And whatever they couldn't sell in bulk to these kind of industries, they would just recirculate back directly to households. And so through this kind of system of circulation, you can see we have coupons being produced here that might be recirculated all the way into a new administrative region. And to illustrate briefly how I'm able to reconstruct these networks, I'll just read briefly from the self-confession of one man who was one of those coupon runners. So this guy, in his account, what he's explaining to the government officials that are prosecuting him, he said, "I began trading these coupons, priceless securities, in 1963. At first, my business was small scale, but eventually I connected with a coupon broker, one of those wholesale agents, by the name of Chin. I didn't have any capital at that time, so Chin kicked me the ball, i.e. he gave me coupons on credit without me paying him yet. And so he gave me 600 Gene worth of coupons. I took them and sold them off to my friends, second brother, two-tongue, water dog, some other guys. And by buying coupons at 0.58 yuan per Gene and reselling them at 0.60, I earned my first profit of 12 yuan. So we get a lot of details here about how these networks are connected, how these different actors are engaged with each other, how everyone is earning money on the spread. And it is through the aggregation of individual accounts like this that we can begin to, like I said, reconstruct these patterns of entrepreneurial activity and, as well, their effects on society. And as we've seen in this brief example, just the illicit coupon trade involved a whole gamut of actors who were recirculating coupons and who were also creating an intersubjective basis of value for things that were supposedly declared valueless by the state. And by assigning market value to coupons in the form of black market prices, they ostensibly helped transmit information about supply and demand and recirculate these coupons into more productive channels. So that's the kind of meso-level analysis I was talking about. The reading of dozens of cases together, but it's still pretty traditional. You're still just looking at the information contained within sources and then juxtaposing it together. Yeah?
Government tie these coupons to individual IDs instead of just cash? Because that would have prevented this kind of trading,
yeah, sure.
right?
They tried to, but you're the Mao state. It's 1950, 1960. You have, a couple million people in your administrative bureaucracy, and you have a population that you're managing of 500 million. I mean, it's huge. It's complex. Their systems of control were simply not they weren't robust enough to deal with this kind of activity. And in fact, they were constantly worried that they're getting the distribution of coupons wrong, that it's causing some people to go hungry, some people not. The mechanisms of knowledge, information exchange and stuff like that are really rudimentary. So I think there's a mythology maybe about how powerful some of these socialist states are because they are authoritarian and they do centralize a lot of control, but their capacity is really limited. And so this is, in other words, the best they could do.
And when they cash in their coupon, check them off, right? Like some kind of voting system, or is
They-
that even?
Yeah, they did. They tried to. And then they also tried to restrict the space of these coupons. You had coupons at different levels. So I gave a very, one-dimensional kind of depiction of this. But the coupons are being printed at the national level, the provincial level, the county level, and they're constantly trying to say we need to produce more county level, less national level because they're being recirculated illicitly and stuff. So the government's constantly adopting measures to do these things, but then the entrepreneurs are also innovating new measures. When the government stopped producing so much national level coupons, the entrepreneurs responded by illegally counterfeiting them. So they're fine, if you're not going to produce them, we'll produce them. And so they actually smuggled national level coupons out to Hong Kong, where they had really sophisticated printing presses and printing operations, and where the government couldn't crack down on them. And so Hong Kong would just produce tons of these counterfeited things and then recirculate them back into the economy. Yeah.
Is there a one-to-one ratio between the amount of good produced and the amount of coupons produced? Is that set centrally and changed on a month-to-month basis, or how does that work?
Ideally, but practically no. They just simply, like I said, they don't really even know how much is being produced, right? And for example, you might know how much is formally being produced, but all of these people are producing stuff on the side. And you don't even know how many coupons are being printed, really, because it's all these different state agencies are each printing them. Sometimes they're overlapping. Sometimes some areas have overprinted and other areas haven't. So there's all kinds of inefficiencies associated with this formal system, which have to do with state capacity and also with problems of knowledge. And so the entrepreneurs, these people, these illicit coupon brokers, are responding to those inefficiencies, and they're trying to profit from them. And in general, I think they're making things work a little bit better. Yep.
Based on the diagram you had a few slides back, it seemed like a lot of the inefficiencies, or so-called inefficiencies, are actually channeling coupons to underground or operations that shouldn't be happening, at least from the point of view of the government. Mm-hmm. So from the point of view of the government, it doesn't seem like an inefficiency or it doesn't seem like a gap that needed to be filled.
Yeah, sure. But it depends on who the government is, right? So the central government may think that, but the local government may say, hey, we need underground factories. We need stuff to be produced here. The state-owned enterprises aren't being supplied with enough materials. Where are they going to get them if they can't buy them from underground factories? So yeah, what you see is the emergence of this complex ecosystem of illicit circulation, which supports a whole other, kind of illicit industries. Like I said, I just mentioned underground factories, black gas houses, and the labor contract teams. These are all kind of illicit endeavors too, and they're all, so there's a complex economy that's being built out of these actions. Yeah?
Reminds me a lot of the drug trade today. But I think the question is, so the central planning is very inefficient, and the illicit people are taking advantage of those inefficiencies, but somehow they have to be more efficient in their knowledge and their information exchange in order to take advantage of all of that.
Yeah.
On top of which they have to not get caught or not get killed, right? So how would you explain the differential there?
So, I mean,
why are the illicit folks able to just constantly win the arms race?
I mean, they don't. I mean, like I said, it's a negotiated process, right? Like it's going back and forth all the time. There's crackdowns and then loosenings ups and so on and so forth. This is always in flux. I would say that the illicit people are closer to the ground. They use their personal networks to accumulate knowledge. You'll ask your uncle who lives in the city next door, hey, how much are the coupon prices over there when he comes to visit? And then you transmit that knowledge maybe to your network. I found out that people were using telegraphs and letter networks and things like that through the formal postal system and encoding kind of messages about how much the coupons cost there. So they were using all manner of like underground channels to transmit this information. And in fact, like their information a lot of times was a lot deeper because the state wasn't even collecting this information. So they have much better knowledge about supply and demand in many ways than the state does. Yeah. So let me move on. So I'm going to move to the third type of analysis. So we saw the micro case study and this kind of like meso-level networky type of analysis. And finally, I want to say there's a role for macro-level analysis too. So while meso-level analysis enables us to observe assemblages of people and goods in society, in the economy, rather than individual actors, it still offers little insight into the macro structure of economic practice. And it doesn't really tell us anything about the scale and scope of informal economic activity. And to get a sense of these things, we have to zoom out further still and adopt a really bird's eye view of these sources. And the way to do this, I argue, is by analyzing them as sets of quantitative data. So last year, I procured a really large collection of over 2,000 cases, individual cases of speculators and profiteers from a single county in China. It's this place right here, Chun'an. It's now part of Hangzhou, a lake county in the middle of Zhejiang. And over the course of 8 months, I read through these 2,000 individual cases, and I typed up types of data that were contained within these documents. These are all handwritten manuscripts. So the only thing I can do is like OCR for Chinese text is not as developed as phonetic Western script. And manuscripts are just impossible. You're not going to be able to do anything. So I just had to manually type up everything. But I was able to build a large relational data set. Don't worry about the specific information there, but the idea is that every case was entered as a unique row in this data set. They're all assigned a unique number, and then they're related. So we have, this sheet shows all the individual cases. This sheet shows all the goods. So for example, one case might involve 5 different types of goods. So we use these IDs, one-to-many kind of thing. We also have a lot of information about the people that were involved who were being prosecuted. And then I also have information on the edges, the connections between places. If someone buys some good in Hangzhou and moves it to Shanghai, I can establish an edge between those places. And so we get a lot of information about, like I said, the people involved in illicit economic activities, the goods that are being seized by the state agents, and how these entrepreneurs are ultimately punished. And so what do these tell us about the functioning of the macroeconomy? Well, first, the data set reveals something about the scale of illicit economic activity. Here we can see a distribution of cases. These are the value of cases calculated by state agents, i.e. the amount of money and goods that they seized at the prices they evaluate them at, which are much, much lower than market prices. As we can see, the data has a huge right tail, and it actually extends into the tens and tens of thousands. But the mean value we get is about 212 RMB. So the mean case involves about 212 RMB of goods in their calculation. Now, because these goods are being calculated at the prices officials are using, rather than the market values, this is really strongly downwardly biased. And when they're seizing stuff like ration coupons, well, those are theoretically valueless, so they just enter 0 for that. So these cases actually involve a lot more money than this. It's approximately at least twice as much. But anyway, we'll use that 200 RMB value to just get a sense of how big it is. So to put this in perspective, we can compare this. This is Angus Madison, and he looked at the per capita consumption figures throughout the socialist era. And as we can see, rural consumption, this red line, grew really slowly throughout the entire period. And in fact, it never really exceeds 150 RMB until almost the reform era. This means that the mean case, which involved the seizure of more than 200 RMB of goods, represented nearly 2 years of consumption for a rural worker. So these are a lot of goods being seized. In other words, the illicit economic activity, at least the ones that was being prosecuted by the state, had scale. The mean entrepreneur that's being prosecuted is not a farmer selling a couple of chickens. It's a trader who's dealing in a quantity of goods that represents years of income for the average worker. More interestingly, though, the data set also provides insight into the spatial scope of these activities. So here we get the spatial distribution of these networks. Don't worry about the value, but just get the general kind of impression of the shape of the networks. So as we can see, illicit activities did not just occur within administrative units. Remember, Chuen An is this green one right here. The illicit activities are not bound up to that immediate region. Rather, they're being carried out across really large spaces. As we can see in this magnified area, this kind of core cluster, for the people that know the geography of China, this core cluster kind of transitions smoothly into adjacent provinces as well. It's not being contained by administrative boundaries. These activities are transgressing boundaries. And we also saw there's distal connections which extend all the way to the very north of China and well into the interior. And what I find really interesting, if we compare this map with this one, this is from William Skinner. Some of you may know him. He was a kind of anthropologist, geographer kind of guy. And he had this classical delineation of the regions, the macro regions, physiographical macro regions of China. And he said these are the regions in which traditional commerce networks existed. So if we compare our core region here to this, it looks a lot like William Skinner's Lower Yangtze macro region. And so from this kind of preliminary evidence, we might conclude two things. One, the economy was, well, a lot more networked than previous people have said. There's a lot more network connections between places. And two, illicit economic activity, it looks like, is being shaped a lot more by these traditional networks than by the socialist administrative boundaries. He's talking about imperial China for like 500 years. So according to Skinner, this is how commerce was carried out in imperial Chinese society. So I think these are some of the insights that we can develop through quantitative analysis of these sources. So to briefly summarize, in this talk I've highlighted the lacuna in our understanding of the Chinese socialist economy. And I've tried to point to the use of these unconventional sources bought from secondary document markets as a possible means of beginning to fill this void. Moreover, I've argued in favor of a mixed method, kind of bottom-up approach to analysis, which really differs from how historians have tried to explore the economy in the past. As I've shown, while the traditional case study method that other historians would use enables us to explore some really interesting aspects of entrepreneurship in society, such as the processes of valuation and the legitimization of their activity, it also suffers from really strong limitations. In order to make more generalizable claims and deal with issues of scale and scope, we must read increasingly large collections of these grassroots sources at different levels of distance. And I've just suggested that no single mode of analysis, how I've generically termed them macro, meso, micro, none are intrinsically superior to the others, but each lends to different types of questions. And each yields insights which really can be combined together and used to maximize the utility of these sources. Finally, while I did not explicitly attempt to make really big overarching historical claims, the implications, I think, of this research are wide-reaching. As we've seen from these limited vignettes, the socialist economy was quite dynamic and complex, at least way more so than previous scholars have suggested. And it requires no great feat of imagination to see the connections between these entrepreneurial processes, these nascent kind of things that were building up during the socialist era, and the broader processes of historical change, how the Chinese economy takes off in the 1980s, say. And I'll be very happy to talk about this and anything else you want to talk about in the Q&A. Thank you.
Do you want to field questions?
No, go ahead, or whatever, sure. Yeah?
So one of the things I'm curious about, even after hearing all the different levels of analysis, is like a notion of baseline. I'm really struck by the problem of scale, right? I know that there are substantial trade routes from the macro analysis. I know that there's this case of the fashion designer from the micro analysis.
Yep.
And I still don't know whether this is big or small. And so I'm wondering how you thought about baselining this. For example, is there a comparison to other sources of sort of legal trade, or what's the notion of scale there?
Yeah, absolutely. So for one, I think, we face a fundamental problem, as we do with any kind of like Maoist era sources. For one, the high-level statistics that some people use are just garbage. I mean, they're pretty much made up. And there's a really big knowledge problem in society, right? If you turn to those high-level statistics, they are so subject to various kind of political incentives and misincentives that you really can't trust the data. So I think the only thing we can do is do this kind of reconstruction of like bottom-up method of analysis of using large collections of sources to rebuild data. But as you say, I mean, this suffers from limitations too, because ultimately the people that we know about are the people who were prosecuted by the state. In some sense, they're the people who failed at entrepreneurship, right? I mean, the really successful ones never got caught. And I've interviewed a lot of those people, actually, and they went on later to form really impressive enterprises in the 1980s. And actually, China's first big generation of entrepreneurs after reform and opening up, it was mostly these guys who were doing underground illicit economic activity in the 60s and 70s. So anyway, there's fundamental limitations to how we can extrapolate this. But there are some things we can do. This at least provides a baseline. We can say we know at a minimum this is how big the economy is. And then, of course, then we can try to do clever tricks to extrapolate from that. Like, does this represent 10% of economic activity? We can look at, for example, as you have waves of political prosecution, as you have like these kind of mass campaigns, right, where the government will say you need to intensify your crackdown on capitalism. We can look at how, as the cases of these attacking speculators and profiteers increase, the value of the activities decrease. So you can maybe see then like how they're getting into more increasingly marginal kind of entrepreneurs and stuff like that. So we can play with that to get a sense. The next big thing I'm doing, so like I said, that database took 8 months to construct, and there's all other kinds of analysis we can do from that. But in order to make it really useful, I need to compare it to another region. So I have another county in China right now where I have over 1,000 cases. And so we can do we have similar longitudinal data where we can begin to compare and contrast, for example, how economic governance in one county versus another county, how, for example, how much did local government officials protect entrepreneurs versus how much did they, prosecute them like to death? We can begin to ask questions like this, and then also through those types of analysis also get a little bit better sense of the scale of activity. And then finally, as you said, then we can start comparing it to formal industries and stuff directly, but you have to make a lot of extrapolations from this. So I think the best thing to do first is establish the baseline. To say, look, at a minimum, this is how big illicit economic activity was, and we know it's a lot bigger. But then it's just a matter of, okay, what ratios are we applying? Like what kind of,
It's interesting. I'm really struck in what you just said by also the fact that the interview, which I guess is a very micro analysis, but the interview evidence that shows that many of the big successful enterprises were exactly these kinds of people. That seems, since we know how big those are later, it speaks to the importance of this phenomenon back in time.
Yeah, and I think another thing to think about when you're thinking about entrepreneurship in this area, so I do care about the quantitative aspects, but there are really interesting quantitative aspects which are fundamental, right? So the fact that these individuals are building networks, the fact that they're amassing entrepreneurial experience, and the fact that they're accumulating some capital prior to reform and opening up is really critical. Because it's this knowledge, for example, it's the knowledge of how do you navigate this margin of acceptability? All of these people are doing illicit stuff. But it's only the ones who are really egregiously violating the law that are being punished. And of those, even most of them, actually most of these guys, they're not like being sent to labor camp. They're not being executed. Actually, the state, this is fascinating, and I didn't include this analysis, but I'm working on it right now. The state is just fining them. And in fact, a lot of times it doesn't even fine them. It just seizes their goods. And sometimes when it seizes their goods, they don't even just seize them. They pay them for them. They just pay a discounted price. And that speaks volumes to me, right? The fact that you have the state arresting these capitalists who are supposed to be the worst people in society, the deepest threat to socialism. The fact that you're arresting them, taking their goods, and then paying them for them. And so I think you see what increasingly over time, local government officials start becoming they recognize the value of these people, and they start working with them, and they say, okay, even if we are going to arrest you, just take this fine and then keep doing what you're doing, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of tacit negotiation going on. Anyway, I think all of these kind of quantitative findings too, or qualitative findings, are really important for understanding where Chinese entrepreneurship comes from, where the origins of like the economic success later comes from. Yeah, sorry.
I might have said this because I came in.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. How much do these individual entrepreneurs group together, and to what extent do they, when they group together, resemble what might be, from some perspectives, be called organised crime in other societies?
Yeah. So with the ration coupons, yeah. So the first thing I was thinking of too, it looks like the drug trade. It looks like someone running like heroin or something like that. Like that kind of organizational structure is pretty similar. So okay, one, I would say I need to clear up something. So when I'm talking about entrepreneurship, I'm not talking about just petty entrepreneurship. I'm not talking about entrepreneurship at the margins and things like that. These entrepreneurial functions are being engaged. People are doing this underground economic activity, are both state actors, non-state actors. They're in formal enterprises, they're in underground enterprises. So it's something that really permeates society. And as you were asking, the networks include groups of these people. So for example, I interviewed some guys that used to work for state agencies, and every state agency has to have a procurement officer. He's the guy that gets you your goods that your state agency needs. Every factory has one too and everything. And I found out that in one city in China, there were more than 30,000 of these procurement officers illegally there buying up wood. Because wood is like a really rare, thing, and it's a short supply in the Maoist economy. And I was asking the guy, and it's really far away. I mean, it's like the distance from say Miami to Boston. Like that's how far away where the guy was based, his affiliated institution, and then the place he's buying the wood. And I asked him, how did you get it back? What were you doing? He said, well, first you have to go there, and then you have to take the officials out to dinner, and you have to give them cigarettes. You have to do, you have to smooze them a little bit and bribe them a little bit. And then they will write you a coupon saying, okay, you get this much wood. But of course, it's still illegal. Like it's still not part of the formal procurement system. So then when that wood is loaded on the train, you can't let it get inspected by the train officials. So then the people have to run ahead of the train. The trains are slow at that time, not that hard. You run ahead of the train, and at every inspection station, you then take out all the inspection officers to dinner. Give them some cigarettes. And then by doing that, you get your goods back home all the way. And this involves, like all manner of actors. You have state actors are the main ones who are doing it. You have like inspection officials. You have underground entrepreneurs that are helping them like move the wood and do other kinds of stuff too. So you have like these networks that are, really big, and they're involving all manner of kind of formal and informal actors. Yeah. Yes.
How did this compare with the fixers in the Soviet economy?
Sorry?
How did this compare with the fixers in the Soviet economy, which I gather informally were also extremely important to actually keeping things working?
Yeah. I mean, I see it as being very similar. There are maybe some critical differences.
Now you might ask, why did the Chinese do so much better after liberation than the Russians?
Exactly. I think, so my argument would be, the reason why the Chinese do so much better is because they don't immediately try to transition to capitalism. And instead, they kind of institutionalize this. So they basically say, okay, so over the 1970s, leading up to reform and opening up, I have my quantitative evidence now that shows that these prosecution of illicit economic activity ramps up. But people keep failing. Like the government is trying to suppress this underground capitalist stuff, and it's not working. There's more and more. There's reports by government agencies saying we've led 5 major crackdowns, and the number of illicit merchants in the city just keeps growing. And so and then eventually you start to have this tide of local government officials. I was actually able to interview, I think he's the first man in China, first local government official who opened up this thing, who finally said, the cracking down's not working, I'm just going to let them do it. And that was in like 1976, 1977, right before reform and opening up. And so in my opinion, reform and opening up, when Deng Xiaoping said, we're going to reform the economy, he was looking to, there was all kinds of reports that were being sent up about the pervasiveness of illicit economic activity. He was looking to that and saying, look, it already exists. So now it's just a matter of either formalizing it or keep failing at suppressing it. And so he was able to, at least at a minimum, harness that momentum that was building up and then use it to push for reforms. And then, of course, once the reforms start, everything explodes. It just happens so much faster than they had intended to. But in the 1980s, I think, you see the government kind of recognize the importance of this space for negotiation, to allow people to break a little bit of the rules. And then whatever works, we'll formalize.
I read a book about the failure of the Soviet Union economy in the latter half of the 80s. And one of his themes was the comparison with the Chinese. And his theory is it was because of the Cultural Revolution that the Chinese did so well. Because the Cultural Revolution sort of corresponded to Stalin's terror, but it was much more recent. So there'd been much less opportunity for institutional structures to build up that would effectively resist liberation.
So I would agree with that in part. I would say, and Huang Yasheng at MIT and I are co-authoring a paper on this. Our argument is, yeah, the Cultural Revolution mattered a lot. But it had the opposite effect of what they intended. So so the Cultural Revolution, it was, they intended to crack down on the capitalists. But what ultimately happened was the whole bureaucratic apparatus came under attack. And stuff effectively shut down. So the Gongshang, the Bureau of Industry and Commerce, basically stops functioning during the Cultural Revolution. And these were the main guys charged with, governing the economy. And they actually create this new institution, beautiful name, Office of Attacking Speculators and Profiteers. But it's a political institution. And the way it's trying to attack these underground capitalists is very different. It's not doing it systematically. It's picking a couple of people and then parading them, in front of society to put them on show. And so our argument is, yeah, actually the Cultural Revolution, by shutting down the bureaucratic apparatus, it effectively created space in especially the rural economy for these entrepreneurs to really start doing new stuff. And that led to all kinds of the formation of these networks, formation of underground factories, and lots of innovation.
Actually, we have to bring this to close for the time, it's hard to say. But we have a reception, we have some food and snacks just outside the hall. If you just pass through the elevators and on the other side, I would highly encourage you all to join us for a few minutes and wait around. So let's take a chance to thank Adam for that talk.